Welcome, everyone. I'm Susan Suarez. I'm President and CEO of the Holocaust Museum and Cohen Education Center here in Naples, Florida. And I'm very excited to be with you all to discuss the wonderful documentary, Repairing the World, Stories from the Tree of Life. Let me start with a little bit of background about the Movies That Matter of Southwest Florida series. The mission of the Movies That Matter series is to educate and engage and facilitate discussion about human rights topics through film. Beginning last year, the film series was named in memory of Steve Brzezina, museum volunteer docent and co-founder of Movies That Matter. The films were carefully selected by our committee for their significance, relevance, and importance of the topics for discussion. The films are all documentaries, and the discussions are facilitated by individuals with expertise in the topic of the film. This 2023 is our 6th season. I'd like to thank our committee, our partners, and our sponsors of the Steve Brzezina Movies That Matter series. Today, we're so fortunate to have Mike Canary of WGCU as our moderator, as well as several distinguished panelists with us today who know a great deal about the issues raised in the film. And with that, I turn it over to Mike.
Good afternoon, everybody. I am Mike Canary. As she said, I'm a radio producer and host here at WGCU Public Media. We are joined this afternoon by 3 members of Southwest Florida's faith community. Rabbi Adam Miller, he's senior rabbi at Temple Shalom in Naples. Reverend Tony Fisher is the lead minister at the Unitarian Universalist Church of Greater Naples. And Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris Ewing is a member of the steering committee of the Interfaith Alliance of Southwest Florida. For starters, I'd just like to give everyone a chance to say hello and introduce themselves. Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris Ewing, let's start with you.
Thank you, Mike. I appreciate that. My name is Sharon Harris Ewing. I'm a retired United Church of Christ minister and member of Naples United Church of Christ, and served for a little while on the staff there as an assistant minister since we retired to Naples in 2016. But the reason I'm here today, and the reason I'm so excited to talk about this just incredible film, is that I've been part of the steering committee, the group of people that got started and is leading the Interfaith Alliance of Southwest Florida, which cares a lot exactly about the kinds of issues that are raised in the film. So I'm sure there'll be lots more opportunity to talk about that, but that's kind of my immediate connection, and I'm really happy to be here. Thank you.
Reverend Fisher, let's go to you next.
Thanks, Mike. My name is Tony Fisher. I serve the Unitarian Universalist Congregation of Greater Naples. This is my 10th year in service here, and 10th year in continuing to get to know this wonderfully vibrant community of Southwest Florida. And also within that time, becoming aware of the divisions that exist here, and the polarities and the potentials within those polarities for conflict. And I am also a member of the steering committee for the Interfaith Alliance, but also sit on numerous panels and boards for organizations here in Southwest Florida that really are working for justice in many different directions. And that is one of the important pieces of my ministry here in Naples.
And Rabbi, sorry about that. Rabbi Miller, we're going to end with you for the introductions.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for being here and for the invitation to be a part of this program today. I'm Rabbi Adam Miller, the senior rabbi at Temple Shalom in Naples, Florida. I've been at Temple Shalom now for 13 years. This is my 14th year. And Temple Shalom is the oldest and largest synagogue in Southwest Florida, having started a little over 60 years ago, and now over 930 households. I'm here representing the Jewish community, and I'm here as someone who remembers quite viscerally the experience of that day on October 27th, of being at services and what it was like as the news began to spread, the responses and reactions that came afterwards, as well as being mindful that this film probably could not come at a more critical time, given what's going on right now in the world, with the tragic massacre that took place in Israel and the response afterwards, and all the things that we were dealing with the rise of anti-Semitism and other acts of hate in the wake of those experiences. This is a very timely film, I think, for us to start some very important conversations and discussions, both in our community locally and be mindful of what's going on in the world around us.
All right. Before we start with the questions, I just want to remind everybody out there who's watching us, this type of Zoom event that we're on means that you can only see and hear us. We can't see or hear you. So if you want to ask a question at any time, just use the Q&A function that's at the bottom of the screen. It'll pop up a little dialog box, and then we'll see those questions as they come in, and we'll try to get to as many of them as possible. So I just finished watching the film. I watched part of it earlier this week, and then I watched the whole thing from beginning to end just a few hours ago. So it's still very fresh in my mind, and it's a very powerful film, clearly. I want to give each of you a chance to just reflect on it and what it brought out in you, what it made you feel, and we'll get a little further down into the questions. We'll try to connect it to what's going on here. Rabbi Miller, let's start with you. What did what was it like for you watching that film? Like you said, having been personally or adjacently affected by the events that it documents.
Yeah, thank you. Watching the film brought back some very tough emotions. I remember on October 27th, we had a bar mitzvah at Temple Shalom here in Naples, and it was a very well attended one with a lot of young families and members of the community present. And I noticed during services, there was a bit of a buzz, and I couldn't quite figure out what was causing it. We kept going through the service, and I could see people looking at their phones and whispering to each other. And as soon as the service was over, one of the people came up to me very quickly and said, "Rabbi, you have to know, there's been a shooting at a synagogue in Pittsburgh." And at that moment, my heart dropped, because I've been very aware of all of the violence that's happening in this world, of the issue of gun violence, something we've advocated around in our synagogue. And so to hear that there was a major shooting at a synagogue in North America, the largest massacre of Jews in North America, happening at the same time that we were gathered together in services, puts a chill down your spine. And to watch the film and see from the people who had been inside the building what they were going through, in many ways brought back some of those emotions that I felt in that moment, and brought back that sense of feeling like this is something I never, in my worst nightmares, thought would happen here in America. It felt like something from a movie or from generations past, not something that would happen in the present. And I know this is in the wake of the shooting at the church in Charleston. This is in the wake of so many different events that have happened where you've seen this kind of gun violence taking place in different settings, but then it feels real because it's happening to you, to someone like you. And as I'm watching the film, I was struck by the reaction afterwards. It brought me back to what happened here in the aftermath of that event, that we were able to gather up a Shabbat of solidarity. I believe both of my colleagues were at that event. I think, Reverend Fisher, you actually spoke at the Shabbat of solidarity we held at Temple Shalom, where we were able to gather, just a week after the event, more than 1,500 people packed our synagogue to overflowing, spilling out into the outside areas. People on their way on Pine Ridge, when they got stuck a mile away, turned home, went back home to watch it on live stream, because it was that much of an event for people to be at. And civic and faith leaders from across Southwest Florida were there to speak. Of particular note, having Imam Muhammad al-Darsani there talk about his relationship to the Jewish community and his time growing up and his feelings about trying to bring people together for peace. Having so many different ministers and other people speak was very powerful. Some of our congressional representatives were there and they spoke. It was quite a moving experience. And then I contrast that in the film with seeing what's happened in Pittsburgh afterwards, with the efforts to continue to get together, to grow and form community bonds. And the fact that while we had that remarkable Shabbat of solidarity, we don't have quite that same response here afterwards. That some of those who got up and spoke about the need to bring communities together have since gone on to become very polarizing figures politically. Others who were there and gave voice to wanting to bring community together haven't really been part of any of the efforts that have been put forth to create community bonds and coalitions. So it brought me back, but it also reminded me of the things that places where we didn't succeed, where they might have in Pittsburgh, and to think about what it means to have that Pittsburgher feel, to have a community connection and identity. That's something that we don't quite have here in Southwest Florida, where we're all from somewhere else, which is its own gift. But we don't have that same cohesiveness, I think, as a community identity that I saw in the film. So all these things were floating around, and I want to give space for my colleagues to talk as well, but it definitely was an emotional reaction to seeing it. It was almost too painful to hear from those who had been inside the synagogue during the shooting, just because of what has just happened in Israel, and feeling like this is a replay on a larger scale, but here we are yet again.
It's an interesting point about how we are all from somewhere else here, so we don't have that same deep community. Before I have Tony and Sharon weigh in on their thoughts on the film, I just want to introduce Patrice O'Neill is the film's producer and executive director. Patrice, welcome this afternoon.
Thank you for hosting this screening and for being here today, and your powerful words, Rabbi. How do we build that sense of cohesion in our community? That's why we made this film, is to try to offer a model and spark that kind of conversation.
Before we move on real quick, can you just tell us about Not in Our Town? It's a really interesting ongoing project that's now been around for coming up on 30 years, if I'm not mistaken.
Not quite 30, but close, over 25. And Not in Our Town is the name of a film that we did in the mid-90s about people in Billings, Montana, who stood up when white supremacists were trying to organize in their town. And I think the power of that movie, it was a very short half-hour PBS special. It was about what ordinary people did in the face of hate. And it was about this solidarity across the board. So when a Black church had skinheads show up to intimidate a very small congregation, members of other denominations showed up and the skinheads went away. When a Native American woman's house was plastered with racist graffiti, members of the painters union came to paint it over, and 100 neighbors were there to watch. So then when a 6-year-old Jewish boy placed a menorah in his window for Hanukkah, a brick was thrown through the window, landed on his bed. People knew that things were getting more dangerous. So they said, what if we're all Jewish? And that year, 10,000 people put menorahs in their windows. So that simple story about the role each of us can play in standing up and making a huge difference sparked a movement, and people started identifying with the name of the movie, Not in Our Town. And we have been following that story ever since. So this film is the 6th PBS special, public television special in that series, but there are over 100 short videos. And we have learned so much from communities across the country over these many years.
Thank you for explaining that. I'm going to go back to the, first response to the film. Reverend Fisher, what did it make you think and feel and reflect on?
I watched it first with my wife, and we both sat there in silence, and I think in some degree of pain and watching a community go through such grief and trauma. And then I watched it again to try and sort of gather my thoughts about this conversation. And yet the second time through, I found it sometimes even more challenging to keep it on. And in fact, I had to stop it every once in a while and just let and sit with it. And in that process, realize that what a gift it is to be able to turn it off and give yourself some time, when knowing in the midst of that kind of grief and trauma every day, there's no way to turn it off. And the folks who the immediate folks who lost loved ones, the folks in the community who came and stood in solidarity and continue to do so, they haven't turned it off. And reflecting on Adam's comments about the Shabbat for Solidarity, and what an incredible feeling it was to stand on the bima and speak about hope and the passion for coming together, and yet finding it difficult in this community, especially to keep that going. and thinking during the course of the film, I just hope it doesn't take that kind of event to bring this community together, and how can we do that? And I think that for here, it's a very difficult thing. We're all isolated in various communities that are separated, often gated communities here, and that's problematic in terms of sort of coming together in community. The folks are here, quite honestly, as retirees and hoping to come to paradise to enjoy some of their still viable years in terms of activity and so forth, and to get involved and to speak out, and that's not what they came here for. Been there, done that in some of their communities up north, and I don't mean to make a blanket statement, but that's a significant issue that we face here. For me, the film just raised up a continuing sorrow for the kind of violence we face and the kind of hatred that exists out there. Back in 2008, there was a shooting in a Unitarian Universalist congregation in Knoxville, Tennessee, and 2 people were killed and 7 people were injured. And it happened during a performance given by young people of Annie. And just to think, as I did at that time, how close it came, and that congregation was targeted because of their liberal values and their support of LGBTQ people, and it was a hate crime. And at that point, the response was sort of looking at a lone gunman and thinking about, feeling sorrow for that individual's mental health. But what we're seeing and what we know more clearly now is that this is an ongoing and now growing epidemic of hate being fueled by many different sources. And it's something that needs to be responded to as quickly and as broadly as possible. And yet we struggle with moving beyond an event, as Adam said, and finding, if it doesn't happen here, how do we find that degree of passion for the work and commitment and resilience and that sense of continuity that has to happen if you're going to create community in a place like Naples.
Sharon, what about you? What did this film make you think and feel?
I don't want to repeat some of the things that have been said, so I will try to perhaps focus on a couple of different things. But I want to say again, and I'm just delighted, Patrice, that you are here, because it was an incredibly powerful film. It was painful to watch, but at the same time, what I appreciated was it offered hope. And maybe we can't translate it to Naples right away, but I mean, the depth of the pain, but that people said, we're not going to let that keep us down, and we're going to come together. That, I think, was so important. And I came away thinking about, I mean, the power of hate, but also the power of transformation and the power of interfaith relationships. I would also say, as an individual, I feel like it helped me to have a deeper understanding of the experience of Jews in America. And I will say that one of the things I will never forget, I was not in services at the time of this, obviously, but I have a very close Jewish friend who said to me at the time, "This is the first time in my life that I have felt afraid as a Jew in America." And I will never forget that. And as I have listened to others talk about that, that's kind of the watershed moment when, okay, now we have to have security for all of our events. And now we have to think about how to make sure that we're safe. It changed history, and So I hope that we can find some of the hope that they were able to find in Pittsburgh, even here. And I guess the power of community and relationships. The other thing that, just on a very personal note, I lived for 33 years in Buffalo, which is also a former city of steel. And there were lots of times when I thought, oh, this sounds like Buffalo. And Buffalo, too, is a kind community. It was a wonderful place to raise our family. And there are lots of good things that are happening and have happened there. And at the same time, if you listened to all the kindness and all the wonderful Mr. Rogers neighborhood in Pittsburgh, there was also, I believe it was one of the, at this moment, I can't tell you if it was an African-American leader. I think it was, it may have been one of the Muslim leaders who said, but there is a lot of hate here too. And I certainly know that in Buffalo, in Pittsburgh, and certainly here, there are many, many good things, but there is a lot of hate, and that it is, as one woman said, if we don't speak up, we're part of the problem. So one of those next steps is, how do we speak up? So I could keep going, but I'm going to let you ask another question, Mike.
I'm going to turn it back over to Patrice. Patrice, how, when did you know you were going to make this film, I guess is the question.
Sorry. Well, I think it was, so we've been doing films about community response to hate for many years. And it was in the course of sharing one of our other films, Waking Oak Creek, about the attack at the Sikh temple of Wisconsin, that we started seeing this rise in anti-Semitism. People would speak about it in the discussions we'd have about that film. And it's not that anti-Semitism wasn't there, it's always been there, but this was new and it was deeply disturbing. And we started to see these patterns, so that when the attack at the Tree of Life synagogue happened, it was horrifying. But as journalist A.C. Thompson says, it wasn't surprising. So I think what was remarkable, Shireen Zalas, my filmmaking partner, was there in the days after. And she said, this response in Pittsburgh is tremendous. The entire city is showing up. The entire city is there, as you experienced in South Florida, after this event. But it was the persistence. So we saw what happened. We saw this remarkable intersectional response, interfaith response. But I think it was going back and seeing this probing in the city about how could this have happened and what can we do together to prevent a further act of hate against anyone in our community. That consistent activity by a traumatized community, a deeply traumatized community, particularly the Jewish community. That's what was so inspiring. That's what made us continue to go back and make a commitment to do this film. We spent 3 years making the film, following it over time. Part of the time was in the pandemic, and it was hard to make a film about joint action in the middle of a pandemic, and yet people persisted. And I was so inspired by this story and learning from a community that was trying to heal, but going through the things that we were all going through. I don't know if you remember, there was the election, there was the pandemic, there was the murder of George Floyd. There were deep divisions in our country. There was the rise of hate violence targeting Asians. There was the attack in Christchurch. There was Poway. There was El Paso. We saw these things in the film, but yet through all of that, there was no hiding. There was no, I can't deal with this, it's too hard. There was persistent action and joint action and solace and joy in finding connection. And that is really remarkable. And it is what we need so desperately right now.
As a filmmaker, do you become personally connected to the people who you work with over that period of time? And do you stay with them still today?
So much so. So, for example, I met Pardeep Kalika, whose father was killed at the Sikh Temple of Wisconsin. He and his family and members of the temple became very active in trying to help the community understand more about the Sikh faith. And he and I started traveling, showing the film. He then, is now a leader in Not in Our Town and one of our key speakers that goes around the country and has helped to lead the Not in Our Town movement. In Pittsburgh, we have become so close, particularly to the Mallinger family, who you see there. They travel. We did a series of screenings in Pittsburgh, New Jersey, and Philadelphia, and the Mallingers were there. They send their family when they can't come. They participate in screenings that are held at high schools, and that has been a really, if we have a moment to speak about it, the response from young people to this story is tremendous, and it really takes my breath away to see the kind of actions that they are taking in response to this story. So yes, we do, and we have been, and I count so many people in Pittsburgh as very, very close to my heart and speak with them all the time.
You mentioned young people's response. That was one of the notes that I took, was the first, after the shooting back in October of 2018, it seemed like the first big gathering was brought together by high school students, right?
Hours after the attack, a group of high school students gathered at the Starbucks and said, what can we do? And the adults were already planning the large vigil, one of them that you saw in the film, for that Sunday. But the young people said, we need to be together now. And so they planned this vigil at Forbes and Murray in the center of Squirrel Hill, and 1,000 people organized on social media through these young people, through their parents, came together, and they led that conversation. They led their community in helping to grieve and heal. And we saw them continue that throughout the course of covering the story. And
Hopefully.
they continue to do
Go
that.
ahead.
They continue to do that. I mean, I don't want to take up all the time, but I can tell you a story about what's happening in Pittsburgh now. And it was a highlight of the Eradicate Hate Global Summit as one of the outcomes of the response from Pittsburgh. Leaders from across the world come together to talk about solutions to hate. And last year we screened Repairing the World for some high school students, and we were amazed at their response, their very emotional response. We didn't know what would happen, but they took their conversation immediately back to their school. They were supported by their teachers, by their school superintendent. This year, 15 schools from that district in Allegheny County, all around Pittsburgh, came to screen the film again. And the school districts are giving them the entire year to plan events, to plan anti-hate events in their schools. And just to hear them talk about it and sort of see themselves in the story. Most of the young people were not Jewish. They said they learned more about anti-Semitism and the need to stand up for each other, no matter who is targeted by hate. So that's, I think letting them lead a discussion is, I think, a way to spark deeper action.
After, and this will just be an aside before I ask the next question, but after the murder of George Floyd, when there were protests happening all around the country, I don't know if surprised is the right word, but there were a lot of persistent protests happening in Southwest Florida, and they were primarily led by young people. So that was really, I don't know what the right word is, but it was really interesting to see. Sharon, I'm going to go back to you with the Interfaith Alliance of Southwest Florida. Just tell us a little bit more about it, and then I want to get you and Tony and Adam to sort of reflect on the strength or unification of interfaith alliances here in Southwest Florida. But tell us a little bit more about Interfaith Alliance of Southwest Florida first.
Oh, I would be happy to. It is something I'm very excited about. Interfaith Alliance is a national organization, and in February we had the president and CEO of Interfaith Alliance, Paul Rauschenbusch, who came and gave a presentation about the threat of Christian nationalism and the ways that view that we're a Christian nation and everything should be according to Christian principles as defined by a very small group of Christians is something that we need to be aware of. And it was a very well received presentation. And we had planned ahead and said, okay, we would like to launch a local affiliate. And so that was February. In March, we had our first meeting. I think we have now 190 people on our list, and we have meetings of 30, and they're not always the same people, half in the room and half on Zoom because of snowbirds in Naples. But our goal is to really bring together people of diverse faiths. We're not where we want to be yet in terms of really having every faith that's present here join us, but we're growing, and we're committed to the belief that every person is of equal worth and respect and dignity, and that one of our primary goals for the year is to address and challenge all forms of hate. So that was something we started talking about when we first started meeting in March and April, and it's one of our primary missions. And Tony is also a member of the steering committee. Tony and Adam and I have had conversations about this and ways that we can do it. I see us working through advocacy in terms of getting the messages out, in terms of education and events where we help people to learn things, but also developing interfaith relationships. We're going to do some of that through interfaith worship services. And I thank you, Rabbi Miller, for agreeing to host our Interfaith Thanksgiving service this year. Those of you who are watching, November 20th. We would love to have you join us. And then also, we really want to just begin, as I think I said earlier, to bring people together, to get to know each other, to see each other as neighbors. As Tony said, it's hard in the way that our communities are divided, but it's essential. I'm going to say, Tony, you're just as much involved. If you want to add in terms of Interfaith Alliance, go for it. But I can tell you this is something I've dreamed of all my life. So I'm just very excited. Not naive about the challenges, but I do believe that the positive response we have gotten is precisely because there is such a need, that this is the right time for us to come together.
Anything you'd like to add, Tony?
I do, and I think Sharon said it that we are looking to broaden the base to welcome people of all faiths and no faith to an endeavor to bring a community together to reach out really and not challenge necessarily, but to reach across divides. To as the physical manifestation of bridges and rivers in Pittsburgh was a wonderful metaphor in that community. But the divides are here as well, and trying to reach across those divides somehow in some way. That's the real challenge. I did want to also just sort of touch on Patrice's comment about the youth. And certainly those youth are here. Next week, we're co-sponsoring an event of LGBTQ youth who will be speaking out and speaking out for their community. We do face a lot of anti-LGBTQ an anti-LGBTQ front here in Southwest Florida. which is problematic. We also, not the Interfaith Alliance, but we also have a wonderful group of young people who responded immediately to the Parkland shooting a few years ago and organized events and marches and educational panels. They were just inspiring to watch. The trouble we have, of course, here in Southwest Florida are the new legislative statutes that limit conversation, or at least if they don't technically limit it, are limiting the conversations in our schools about the Black issues, about anti-Semitism, about LGBTQ issues. So if I mean, there are certainly conversations happening, but teachers, administrators are reluctant to back those conversations simply because there are state statutes now in effect that may put them in jeopardy. And so we have that additional obstacle here in Southwest Florida that I think one of the things that the Interfaith Alliance has sort of set as its goal is to really speak out for the educational system and for free and open public education for everyone. And I think Sharon's background is in education, and it's one of the reasons that she's passionate about this, but we all feel the same way. Sort of unlocking that youth piece to this puzzle would be a wonderful thing, and trying to figure out how to do it given the circumstances we face is another.
Rabbi Miller, aside from the Interfaith Alliance of Southwest Florida, which is pretty new, you said Temple Shalom's been around for almost 60 years. Has this idea of interfaith alliances always been present for you, or is this a relatively new thing?
There have been efforts to build community through the faith network that we have here locally. Long before my time, back probably at least 15, 20 years ago, there was a larger ministerial association that existed here in the Southwest Florida area, made up of people from all across the faith map, so to speak. Unfortunately, it dissolved as differences between different religious groups pushed people away and created boundaries that people didn't want to work together any longer. By the time I arrived, there was a fragmented section of that still left over. We had progressive voices, and we had other smaller groups that were separately meeting and not really talking to each other. So this is not new in the sense that we've had it before, but it is definitely new in that it is a brand new effort to try to bring people together. And I'm hopeful that it will lead to a longer term, better environment for addressing these kinds of things. It's not an overnight solution. And we've seen, even in the efforts to try to encourage people to be part of this at local faith groupings, people being a little wary or hesitant because now politics and faith have been mixed together for some people. And so efforts that are made to try to engage on a larger scale or to lobby or to partner together, people start asking questions about, well, is there a political message here? Are we only going on one side or the other side? Where do we stand on this? It's a much more fragmented world than we were 13 years ago when I got here. And it's looking like it just continues to split apart in that way. So it's a challenge to have a very cohesive effort to bring people together. That doesn't mean it's not worth doing. In the Jewish community, we've had an ongoing group, the Catholic Jewish Dialogue, that's brought together our diocese with our Jewish community. Every year they engage in a joint Kristallnacht service, and they also do some other programs and learning opportunities together over the course of the year. So they've been in dialogue, but that's two small segments, and they focus particularly often on Holocaust education and engagement and learning from those experiences. There's an effort coming up in a couple of weeks in the Jewish community to do a partnership program with our local evangelical community, recognizing that that's one of those boundaries that we don't usually go across, is having the Jewish community and the evangelical community work together on different programs. So some people have put together that effort. There are different efforts underway, but there's a lot of challenge out there, and there's a lot of work to be done. Again, doesn't mean we shouldn't be doing it. This is absolutely the sacred and holy work that we've all signed up for. At the same time, we have to be realistic that there's a lot of repair that needs to be done in the world around us.
The Kristallnacht commemoration that you alluded to, I think it's weekend after next, right? One of our participants watching wanted to highlight.
Yes, week after next on Sunday. Yes.
If I could just jump in, I want to pick up on what Tony was saying about education, and it relates to something that Rabbi Miller said too, that I thought was very interesting in the film, listening to the students in class and the teacher who said, I realize that we've been teaching students that anti-Semitism is just the Holocaust, and that it was long before that, and it continues long after. And I think in terms of what Tony said about the limits of recent legislation, that's even scarier to me. That how are we going to get not just a little tiny picture, but the big picture of what is involved when we talk about anti-Semitism and acts of hate against the Jewish community. So thank you for letting me jump in.
Mike, if I might add to that, I think it's an important sidestep of conversation about what's happening with regards to anti-Semitism, and to raise a little bit of awareness, because we say anti-Semitism and it's kind of a blanket that's used to cover a lot of different pieces of the puzzle. And especially when it comes to the education piece. So I want to get to a couple different elements here. One is that there's anti-Semitism that comes from the left, which tends to be rooted in anti-Zionism, anti-Israel sentiment. And there's anti-Semitism that comes from the right, that tends to come from the hard right, the white nationalists, from Christian nationalism, from the neo-Nazi groups. Here in Southwest Florida, quite honestly, we do not see very much of the anti-Israel form of anti-Semitism. That's not a very loud presence here. It doesn't mean it doesn't exist, but it is a little bit more muted here than in other parts of the country. However, the far right anti-Semitism is something alive and well here, unfortunately. And we've seen it in distribution of flyers by an organization called the Goyim Defense League. We've seen it in acts of defacing property and things with anti-Semitic messages that are clearly from that far right element. And we saw it in the spring when, as I was leaving a school board meeting, I was verbally accosted by two individuals who were shouting anti-Semitic remarks at me here. So it is alive and well here. The challenge is, how do we respond to it, and how do we identify it? And one of the parts, I saw one of the questions that was posed was asking about Gaza and Israel. We can get to that in a little bit, but I will note that when news got around that I'd been accosted verbally after the school board meeting, I heard from people all across the community immediately who were upset that there was this kind of anti-Semitism that was so blatant that someone go not just randomly at a person, but went specifically at the rabbi of the large congregation to do this in broad daylight. They were appalled that that existed and they wanted to speak out about it. It's been far fewer voices who have spoken out when 1,300 Jews were slaughtered by Hamas in Israel. And I don't know if that has to do with the fact that it's not in America. I don't know if people just don't know what to say, and maybe they're just slow to figure out how to reach out. But I think it's very telling that we have a lot of work to do when the response to the number who were killed in the Tree of Life was significantly greater. The response to a verbal attack was significantly greater than what took place in Israel on October 7th. And I think that's something we all have to wrestle with, the ethics of why that is and what the response has been. One note on the youth education piece, by the way, I think we're all missing an important component here, is that we tend to think about the education of students to deal with anti-Semitism as a classroom issue, as a school issue, even as a parent issue. And it's actually not any of that. It has to do with the internet and what our kids are seeing and doing when parents aren't paying attention. I have had countless conversations with teens who've been brought to me by their parents, appalled because they did something that was deemed anti-Semitic and they're being punished by their school, and you need to go talk to the rabbi and talk about where this comes from. And the parents turn to me and say, we don't know where he gets this from. We go to church. We're faith people. We have a lot of Jewish friends. And the kid says, well, I saw it on this YouTube show I was watching, and the person da-da-da, or I got it from a video game I was playing online, da-da-da, and the parents are shocked. But there is an awful lot of negative education taking part for our children, for the youth of today, well away from classrooms, and it's happening in time and places and with individuals that they're trusting more than their educators. So as much as I applaud efforts to do education in the classroom, we have a lot of other work to do to really clean up what is out there, what our kids are seeing, and who's indoctrinating them before we even get a chance to really engage with them in a constructive manner on these very important subjects.
You mentioned the comments that we got about what's going on now in Israel and Gaza, so I'm going to go ahead and bring that in, and I'll let you start with Rabbi Miller. The comment comes in from Rachel. It says, "I so appreciated the film, both the depth of sadness and the height of hope I felt after viewing it." And it's going to be a tough question, but try to answer it. How do you see the Pittsburgh events and the community's response offering hope and healing for what's going on now in Israel and Gaza, and including the rise of global anti-Semitism and hate?
It's a hard question.
Yeah.
And I'll tell you, after Pittsburgh and watching the movie, I have hope. But after what I've experienced, it's muted. It really was telling the small number of people who reached out from outside of the Jewish community. And it's not the people who are on this panel with me. They're some of the few who did. But a number of neighbors and friends and people who I've walked alongside in justice work in all different settings have been absolutely silent. And it hurts. And this is something that the Jewish community has felt all across North America. It is a common thread. There's a viral post going around from a popular writer that says, "You might have lost all your Jewish friends and you don't even realize it." And it's written to the non-Jewish community for all the people who have not said anything or not reached out to check how people are doing. Every single person in the Jewish community felt this personally. If we knew someone who was killed or someone who was wounded or taken hostage or not, it happened to us. This was the single largest killing of Jews on one day that's happened since the Holocaust ended. And to not have anybody reach out or talk to people or just to say, "I don't know what to say, but I feel like you probably need me to be there with you." That's all we needed. And that silence has been deafening, both from individuals and from organizations. Even worse have been the number of organizations across our country. And I want to be clear, we haven't seen this very much in this area of Southwest Florida, but in other parts of the country, the number of organizations that have not spoken out when students or other groups have said that what Hamas did was correct or that Israel brought it on themselves. I understand that war involves casualties and loss and pain. And there is not a single person in the Jewish community who wanted, before this happened, for there to be conflict, to be war, for there to be anyone being killed on either side. But to not acknowledge that what took place first was an act of terror, going in and slaughtering women, children, adults, doing horrible, horrific things. I'm so emotionally drained, I can't even name them all anymore without breaking down into tears and getting angry. To not name that and call that out, but to say instead they brought it on themselves as if someone deserved to have that treatment, the message is very loud and clear that Jewish lives don't matter. And to have been someone who marched alongside people at Black Lives Matters events, to be someone who works actively in the justice community and have a number of those people not say a single word, spoke volumes. And to see it happening in places where they're just condoning and not stepping up and saying, "No, you can't compare these things." It's not saying the loss of life of Palestinian lives is a good thing, not in the least bit. But you need to acknowledge the terror that created this conflict and that brought this to this point. And you need to acknowledge the hostages that are being held. So all of this, you can tell I'm very passionate about this. This is something that really strikes a nerve with me. And seeing this about Pittsburgh, it really hit even harder because I remembered that Shabbat of solidarity, how people came together. And I don't feel that way right now. So, Rachel, I don't know what this says about where the world is going. I think it means we have to do a lot of reflection on why we act the way we do or why we respond or did not respond in this situation. And it's an opportunity for us to learn and to grow from it. But it's hurt a lot. and it's dampened some of my hope for getting past this. And it's also very disconcerting to see the significant rise of anti-Semitism across the country. We've been blessed in our little bubble here in Southwest Florida, but just an hour and a half from here in Davie, Florida, yesterday, there was an incident where in a section of Davie, Florida, a number of people woke up to graffiti and spray paint telling the Jews to get out of the neighborhood now, they're not wanted, and other negative things. This is everywhere, and it needs to be addressed. It needs to be called out. And honestly, I really believe that the only way that anti-Semitism stops is if we have partners outside of the Jewish community who are the first to speak up before we even say a word. I think the same is true for any form of hate. You need people who are not the victims to be the ones who are stepping out, standing up, and doing the work that needs to be done to stop it in its tracks. Because as long as it's just the victims who are speaking out, who are expressing their pain and their suffering, they have no allies. There's no one there with power who can make it stop. And it needs to stop. It truly does. So it's something that I think we can start to address. You know, as it's been said by several people here, anti-Semitism existed long before in America. After the Holocaust, it got swept under the rug for a long time. It has resurfaced in a terrible way, and these current events have just made it worse for us and all over the globe. So maybe this is our chance now to try to learn from the past, not just push it aside, not just mute it, but truly address it and try to change things for the better.
Tony, or would you guys like to weigh in? I don't know if you can add to that or if you would like to even try to add to that, but I'm going to give you a chance.
I have no desire to add to that. I feel totally in solidarity with that, what Adam said, and feel that you know, Patrice's story at the beginning, where she was talking about that community in North Dakota, was it? I think that where
Thanks, Montana,
where 10,000 menorahs showed up in windows is such a powerful one, and it speaks to what Adam's talking about. And I'm absolutely positive that Adam is correct, and that in a similar situation with the Black community, the Black community can't stand up for itself all alone and feel isolated. This requires the larger population of good people, of which I believe are in the majority, truly, to stand up and start speaking out. A couple of points in this film where that was brought forward, and I think the ability to communicate sorrow and regret and grief is something that we struggle with in our society a lot. I mean, I think within our culture, it's we struggle with dealing with grief and trauma and don't know how to act, and that's a problem. And it's a problem that we don't know how to reach out. I think it was one of the victims of I think it was Mr. Legger, I think that spoke and said, you know, here's the hardest thing, to be able to listen and communicate with and help those who are, you know, stuck in that spiral of hate. I can't remember the exact words, but it really struck me. So our individual ability to be compassionate and to express that compassion, to reach out, to express our sorrow, our grief, and our anger, and also to reach out and do that so that the world sees it, and it makes a difference in how the community responds. Because if they don't see a response, they're not going to join. I mean, there's a lot of joiners out there that need some leadership, and that's us. That's each of us. But in terms of clergy people, that's us, in a big way, in our services, in the public arena as well. And so I can only echo and sort of amplify what Adam said, and recognize that, as I said in our service here on the Sunday afterwards, there are people, because Unitarian Universalist is a tradition that honors pluralism. We have within our congregations people of many different beliefs, but joining together on the journey of discovery towards truth. We have people in our community. We have people in this community who are Palestinian, who are feel passionate about their situation, their country, and we have people who are Jewish and who feel passionate about that. What we need to find through our compassion is that line which allows us to hear and tell the truth and to pursue justice there if we have the ability to do so, to speak out and to pursue justice here in whatever we can to limit the divides, to reach across the divides and to make a difference. So yeah, I feel pain, and it's something that I think part of the work of ministry is to be able to feel the pain and then to do something with it, and then to help others do something with it as well.
Sharon, anything you'd like to add? Or
Yeah, I'm
Patrice?
just going to be brief
Go ahead,
because
Sharon.
I know we're coming to the end. I think following up on what Tony said, the saying that used to be out there, think globally, act locally. What is most painful for me about what you were saying, Adam, is what you're experiencing locally and not feeling the support from the community. I will be the first to say that I've often been at a loss for words. And when I try to talk about the Middle East, it becomes, I don't know what to say. But if I think about it in terms of what can I do here for people I care about, then that's a different question, and it's a little easier to manage. And I think I could do better than I've done. And in that sense, the National Interfaith Alliance, the statement that they came out with within a week after October 7th, really said, we're a national organization. We're going to focus on national issues, and that includes we've got to address anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. To Tony's point earlier, I think in this community, we've got to address anti-LGBTQ feelings, because I think they're running high and we're seeing that. But for me, that's where I feel like, okay, I need to do more and be better in my own local community. But I know time is upon us, so I'll stop there.
Patrice, I'm going to let you have the nearly the last word. You raised your hand earlier, so it looked like you were trying to chime in.
Well, I mean, Rabbi, I'm so sorry you felt that. And it just made me think, who are the people that I didn't reach out to? And I reached out to some of my friends, but not all of them. And I feel so bad. And I remember thinking when the attack happened in Israel about the young woman who speaks at the rally, the high school rally, and she says, I'm a different Jew today than I was yesterday. And it just struck me to the core, because that was true on October 27th, 2018, and on October 7th. It's like, where is it safe to be a Jew, right? And I think that feeling is something that people don't necessarily understand. Like, people who are not Jewish don't necessarily understand it. I'm not Jewish, but I try to have some understanding of it. And I think that as, you know, as Sharon said, people don't know how to step into a discussion about what's happening in the Middle East successfully and with, you know, informed opinions. And so they end up saying nothing, which is, you know, not always useful. I sit on the Hate Crimes Coalition for the Leadership Conference for Civil and Human Rights, and it's many of the organizations that represent the leading civil rights groups in our country. And there's so much sadness and so much pain. Many Jewish organizations, Arab, Muslim, Asian, Black, Latino. And Maya Wiley, who leads the organization, said, let's just remember that our compassion is our strength. Our compassion is our strength. And if we can find that, we can find that with each other and pull on that. That is how we're going to get through this very, very, very difficult period. I've never experienced anything like this in my life. All of the things that I've studied hate, I've sort of worked at this. This is a very scary time. And these connections that you have in your community, foster them, think about that pain. Sometimes you go sideways, right? It's like, do we really need to jump into a discussion about what's happening in Israel, in Gaza? Can we talk about how you're feeling, Rabbi, about that? Can we maybe share the story of what happens in Pittsburgh and then get to those harder conversations? But we have to see each other. We have to be able to speak to each other and move those compassionate muscles, move them. And so I'm really so glad I got to be in conversation with you today. I learned so much from all of you, and I hope sometime I get to come to South Florida and share the film in person. And thank you all for what you do in your community.
I'm just one comment from myself, and then I'm going to give Rabbi Miller the final word. When the George Floyd protests were happening, we talked a lot about the issues around it on the show that I host. And I'm not afraid to admit, for the first time, it really occurred to me that it's not enough to be not racist. You have to be against it. And I think there's a direct parallel here. It's not enough to be not anti-Semitic. You have to be against it with your thoughts, words, and actions. Does that make sense, Rabbi Miller?
It does, Mike. Thank you. I want to thank you, Patrice, for that beautiful message right there. And to my dear friends, Reverend Harris Ewing, and to and also to Reverend Fisher. It's been beautiful to be here with you and to share in this conversation. And I think that last piece, Patrice, that you talked about is my hope, which is the relationships that we have. That when you sit down with someone, when you know them, when you're there with them, and you get to really connect with them as a human being, that's how you work together and how you understand each other. That's how you see them as someone who is a human being, just like you, who has the divine spark of being created, B'Tselem Elohim, in the divine image, just like you. No matter what you differ on, you speak to each other differently, you engage with respectfully when you see each other as people. And that comes from our compassion. And I hope that if nothing else out of this conversation, that the people who are in our audience will take it upon themselves to reach out to those who are in their circle, maybe to others, and just ask them to sit down for coffee and check in with each other. Work on either building relationships or on repairing relationships they might not realize have been damaged because they haven't been there for each other. But that human piece of being there for each other is how we're going to get through this. Because when we see each other as people, that's when we will live in a different world, a world where we don't have the pain and the fractionalization that we have today.
All right. Thanks to our panelists. That was Rabbi Adam Miller from Temple Shalom in Naples. Rabbi Miller, thank you so much. Also, Patrice O'Neill is the producer and executive director of Repairing the World: Stories from the Tree of Life. Patrice, thank you so much for being with us today. And Reverend Dr. Sharon Harris Ewing is with the Interfaith Alliance of Southwest Florida. Thanks to you. And also Reverend Tony Fisher from the Unitarian Universalist Church of Greater Naples. And thanks to the Holocaust Museum and Education Center for handling the Zoom logistics today. And just thanks for everybody who's been watching with us this afternoon. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much, Mike. Thanks to everyone, our panelists, and to everyone in the audience. This is a very powerful discussion, and we will be sending everyone a follow-up email with resources. And we hope that those of you who are watching will continue to engage with us on this topic so that we can work to repair our own community. And just a reminder, we have one more film in our series a week from today. It is called The Invisible Class, about homelessness, and we have fantastic panelists lined up for that as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.